December 17, 1944. Ardennes forest, Belgium. Frost clung to the pine needles like glass threads. The forest was still, too still for a frontline sector. Beneath the pines, Private Elias Ward adjusted the thin strap of his helmet, the steel rim biting into the bridge of his nose. His breath rose in short bursts, the air thick with the weight of cold and waiting. Engines of halted half-tracks ticked faintly in the valley below, metal cooling after hours of crawl through snow-clogged roads. Somewhere within that black expanse, over 200 men stood scattered along a narrow trail, waiting for a signal that was never supposed to come. Ward knew the regulation: no light, no radio, no voice. The Germans were close enough to hear a shovel drop. He checked his wristwatch, 02:40. The column was overdue by 20 minutes. Snow muffled everything, even time. He could sense the unease below, the shapes of men looking up toward the ridge where he crouched, expecting direction that wasn't permitted. A faint wind stirred, carrying the smell of diesel and pine resin. To his left, the dim outlines of trees merged into a deeper black where the terrain fell away. Beyond that drop lay the valley road, exactly where reconnaissance reports had warned of German armor movement. Ward's gloved hand hovered over the flashlight. A thin layer of frost covered the glass. His orders were absolute: maintain blackout until 4:05 a.m. But orders were written in daylight, far from this silence. He blinked against the cold, eyes tracing the slope where American boots would soon tread. The path ahead curved through the forest and into the open, exposed against the rising moonlight. It was a perfect place for a kill zone. He knew it. Command didn't. The decision pressed against his ribs like weight. Behind him, snow creaked, just the forest shifting. But in that second, his pulse flared. Every sense narrowed. He had spent weeks scouting these routes, learning how sound traveled between the trees. One spark of light could carry farther than a shout. But if he stayed dark, the men below would walk blind into steel. He turned the flashlight in his palm, thumb resting on the switch. The lens trembled slightly, a ghost of light trying to escape. His body resisted the movement, training and instinct locked in quiet argument. Then, a low thrum drifted from beyond the ridge. Engines, synchronized, mechanical precision cutting through distance. Not American. Deeper, slower. German Panthers advancing through snow. He exhaled, slow and controlled, the kind of breath a man takes before he breaks a rule. The first flicker pulsed into the night. Morse. 3 blinks, short and deliberate. To anyone but his battalion, meaningless. To them, it meant halt, regroup, shift east. He waited, then sent another sequence. The cold made his fingers numb, movements jerky. The light reflected faintly off ice crystals in the air, a fragile thread of defiance hanging between life and detection. Down below, engines stopped. Men froze. The line shifted. Seconds stretched into minutes. The forest returned to stillness. Then, across the valley, a flare burst. German signal, not his. White light poured over snow, revealing nothing but silence where an American column should have been. Ward didn't move. He had saved them by breaking the code. By dawn, the path he refused to guide became a cratered line of wreckage. Trees splintered by artillery. Earth burned black. The first patrol to reach it found empty helmets half buried in snow. Ward never filed a report. His flashlight was confiscated for breach of discipline. The debrief ended with a line that echoed longer than the battle. "You disobeyed correctly." In the frozen woods of Ardennes, one flicker of forbidden light preserved an entire battalion. The system survived because one man broke its rhythm. Would you have turned on the light? Before the Ardennes, Elias Ward's world was defined by rails and signals. Outside Cleveland, his days began with the metallic pulse of switch levers and the ticking of clocks that ruled every mile of track. He had learned early that machinery, unlike men, could be trusted to obey its rhythm. The sound of gears meshing, of brakes hissing in winter air, was language to him. It spoke of order, of how weight and distance could be measured, not guessed. When war came, he carried that logic with him, quiet and unassuming. Others memorized terrain. Ward memorized timing. In training, he walked drills as if they were timetables. Each movement had duration, each breath a fixed interval. His sergeant once said Ward could cross an entire field blindfolded and emerge within 3 feet of where he intended. He didn't deny it. To him, navigation wasn't sight. It was count. Steps, heartbeats, the interval between the sound of his boot leaving snow and the next man's following behind. The rhythm of motion was his compass. By late 1944, that discipline had hardened into instinct. He no longer looked for direction in stars or maps, but in the pattern of air itself, the way wind curved around treetops, or how distant engines echoed off frozen valleys. Fellow scouts joked that he could hear a convoy through fog long before it came into view. They didn't realize that what he heard wasn't noise, but machinery keeping time. In the Ardennes, where paths vanished under snow and silence swallowed distance, rhythm was all that remained. The terrain was a labyrinth of white and shadow. Radios failed. Orders lagged behind reality. Men moved slower than their own fear. Ward didn't fight the stillness. He listened to it. His pace adjusted to the pulse of the forest. Even his flashlight, stripped of its casing and reduced to a filament bulb the size of a fingertip, was not improvisation. It was procedure. Each flicker he sent that night had been pre-counted. 3 blinks, pause, 2 short, 1 long. It looked improvised to anyone else, but Ward had rehearsed those intervals during downtime weeks before the offensive. It was his unspoken code, his system inside the Army's system. The war to him was not chaos, it was malfunction. And his role, small as it was to keep the mechanism moving. He believed survival was not about bravery, but calibration. Every sound he made, every step he took, was measured against risk. His flashlight became part of that calculus, a tool of alignment, not rebellion. When higher command issued blackout orders, he didn't hear caution. He heard a rule meant for the majority. Systems, he knew, were built for averages. But war had no averages. It had moments where the flow stalled, where the machinery jammed. That's when men like Ward intervened, not to lead, but to restore motion. Underneath his calm adherence to sequence lived a quiet defiance. He knew that trust in system alone could kill. The German offensive had shattered the map. Roads meant for supply now belonged to ambush. The flow was broken. To Ward, breaking orders was not disobedience. It was lubrication in a frozen engine. The Army needed movement. He provided it. By dawn, he would become another nameless correction in the log of a vast machine. His light extinguished, his timing preserved in the lives that kept moving east. In war, some men fought for victory. Others fought to keep the system running long enough for victory to exist. The 112th Infantry Battalion moved like a single machine through the Ardennes, its rhythm dictated by watches and engines rather than voices. Every platoon was a gear, every truck, a piston in motion. Ammunition flowed east toward the front. Medical convoys rolled west, carrying the wounded back through frost and silence. Between them ran a narrow corridor of survival, a road system under constant strain, where delay was as lethal as gunfire. The men knew it instinctively. To stall was to die unseen. To keep moving was the rule that kept the war alive. Private Elias Ward's reconnaissance team was one of the smaller cogs in that system. 8 men tasked with verifying bridges, slopes, and intersections before the convoys advanced. They didn't fight for ground. They fought for continuity. Their orders were measured not in victories, but in hours maintained. On good nights, the system ran clean. Headlights hooded, engines in sync, tire chains whispering over ice. On bad nights, the entire structure faltered under static, fog, and exhaustion. The Ardennes turned navigation into arithmetic. Maps were ink on white, useless under fresh snow. Roads vanished overnight. Sound was the only constant, the low hum of diesel breathing through the trees. By December 17th, timing had become the battalion's religion. Trucks left the depot. They met the forward line of the 28th Infantry. Each section advanced according to synchronized watches, an invisible pulse stretching from the Meuse to Bastogne. The precision held the illusion of control. It made chaos manageable. Ward respected that rhythm more than rank itself. He understood that the front's strength wasn't in firepower. It was in flow. But systems built on timing fail when sound disappears. That night, static consumed the field radios. Snow thickened until headlights dissolved into gray walls. Convoy leaders waited for Ward's confirmation from the ridge. A signal meant to be passed through coded flashes, then relayed by word of mouth to the next checkpoint. No signal meant no movement. Engines idled in formation, each vehicle a muted pulse in the dark. Fuel drained. Breath froze. The clockwork faltered. Ward crouched above them, caught between regulation and necessity. The doctrine said silence. The system said timing. The men below depended on both. Behind the stillness, the greater machine of war pressed forward. Artillery timetables, air cover schedules, supply quotas, all aligned on numbers that ignored weather and fear. Ward understood what headquarters never could. When a single rhythm broke, everything downstream staggered. He wasn't deciding for himself. He was deciding for the machine. He looked across the valley. No landmarks, only the faint contour of a frozen bridge somewhere in the dark. He had verified it earlier that week. It could bear the weight of 2 trucks at a time. Beyond it, the road climbed toward an unseen horizon where fuel dumps and aid stations waited on their deliveries. Every hour lost here rippled through the chain, shells unfired, rations undelivered, medics without bandages. So he broke the rule. The flashlight flickered once, twice, held steady. Its glow was small, almost invisible against the snow, but to the men below it was structure reborn. Engines stirred, transmissions engaged, and the line advanced again. What command would call disobedience, the system would record as recovery. In that moment, the battalion's pulse returned. By dawn, the convoy had cleared the valley intact. Ward's light had vanished into his coat pocket, his name absent from the morning report. The system moved on, restored, ungrateful, perfect again in its rhythm. In war, precision wins battles, but defiance keeps them running. Would you have risked the system to keep it alive? It began with a sound that didn't belong, a slow creak beneath the wind, wood under strain, or metal shifting where no American metal should be. Private Elias Ward lifted his head slightly, the fabric of his hood stiff with frost. The noise came again, faint but patterned, weight pressing on ice at uneven intervals. It wasn't wind. It was weight, heavy, measured, deliberate. Somewhere to the north, just beyond the snow line, something large was moving. He didn't call it in. Radio silence was still enforced. Static drowned all channels, and headquarters was half a world away from this ridge. Orders were a theory here. The forest made its own. He drew in a breath through the scarf over his face, testing the air. Diesel. Cold, but present. It clung low to the ground, drifting through the pines like a trace of smoke that refused to vanish. Engines, but muted, idling beneath canvas. He tapped his wristwatch once to steady his nerves. Yo, 2:47 a.m. The convoy below was supposed to roll in 13 minutes. Men stood in formation around their trucks, shoulders hunched, rifles pointed downward, waiting for a light that hadn't come. They couldn't see what Ward saw, or rather, what he sensed. The forest around them was too still. No birds, no wind through branches, only the slow hiss of falling snow, layering itself over everything human. Then, from the distance, A faint metallic groan echoed again, this time followed by another, synchronized like two tracks tightening in unison. He knew that sound. Armor. German. Ward lowered his body against the frozen ground. The snow pressed cold through his coat, seeping into fabric seams, anchoring him to stillness. Through the trees, he caught brief, mirrored flashes, tiny, harmless at first, but repeating at perfect intervals. The reflection of starlight off glass lenses. Observation optics. Someone else was watching the valley too. Behind him, one of his men shifted his weight, the crunch of snow far too loud in the quiet. Ward raised his hand instantly, palm outward. Stop! The motion froze the column. Even from 30 yards away, he could feel their breaths shorten. The stillness became absolute. Then came a new sound, so soft it barely carried. A distant exhale of compressed air, mechanical and restrained. Pneumatics, maybe from a tank's suspension resetting under tension. The sound of weighting metal. He realized then that the Germans weren't moving through the forest. They were already there, parked, engines cold, waiting for movement below to confirm position. The ambush wasn't forming. It was prepared. Ward closed his eyes briefly and reconstructed the terrain from memory. The valley ran east to west, one entry, one exit. His men were the only ones between the column and the kill zone. One signal could turn the battalion south, but that signal required light, and light meant exposure. He measured the distance in his head. A flicker could be seen for a mile on clear air. The snow, at least, would veil it partially. Still, if the enemy spotters were trained, even one glint could fix range for artillery. He felt the pressure of decision settle against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The system had failed. No radio, no updates, no fallback plan. Just silence and expectation. Doctrine said hold. Rhythm said wait. But silence itself had become the alarm. Even the crow that startled from a nearby branch didn't cry. It only vanished into the snow, wings silent, directionless. Ward's breath misted once, slow and steady. The forest around him no longer felt still. It felt suspended, like a spring drawn to its limit. Somewhere, deep in that white vacuum, another man, another watcher, was waiting for the first sign of motion. He lowered his hand to the flashlight buried beneath his coat. Its switch was frozen stiff, metal against skin. He didn't move yet. Timing mattered. If he signaled now, he'd expose everything. If he waited too long, the system would move on its own. The wind shifted again. Snow swept low across the ridge. Ward exhaled, his breath catching the faint glint of the bulb through the wool. Somewhere beyond the trees, unseen tracks turned in place. The forest was no longer quiet. It was listening. Would you have stayed still when the silence itself was warning you? At 02:53 a.m., Private Elias Ward checked his wristwatch. The glow from its radium dial trembled faintly in the cold air. 13 minutes past the scheduled checkpoint signal. The convoy below was still waiting. Engines idling, breath and exhaust mixing into one gray current. Silence had become its own form of pressure. Every minute they remained halted increased the chance that the line behind would overstack, clogging the only route east. The field manual was clear. Maintain blackout until radio contact resumed. But manuals were written for daylight. They didn't account for fog so dense that the world felt erased. They didn't measure how fast order collapsed when sound disappeared. Ward knew this from before the war. Back in Ohio, working as a signalman, where the rhythm of freight lines meant life or loss. A single missed light could turn a smooth timetable into collision. He had seen the aftermath once. Metal folded into metal. Engines still humming under wreckage, as if the machine didn't yet know it was broken. Now, here, that same lesson pressed at the edge of his mind. Systems fail quietly before they fail completely. He scanned the valley. Nothing moved. The snowfall was steady, almost mechanical, coating the frozen branches, and the waiting trucks below. Somewhere deeper in the forest, he sensed the weight of German armor. Motionless, disciplined, patient. He didn't need to see it. The silence carried its shape. The snow muffled all distance, turning the world into one soundless field of delay. Ward shifted his position, knees cracking against the frozen ground. The flashlight in his coat pocket felt heavier than a rifle. Procedure dictated he keep it off. Absolute blackout. He imagined the words written in the operations manual. Under no condition should a forward scout reveal his position through light or sound until command verification is received. He had recited those lines in training, but the reality now was static-filled radios, vanished landmarks, and men who didn't know which way safety lay. He watched the convoy commander below, pacing between vehicles. The man kept looking toward the ridge, waiting for direction that wasn't coming. Ward's throat tightened. Every second lost here translated into vulnerability down the chain. Supplies arriving late, fuel burned for nothing, exposure increasing with each delay. The system didn't break dramatically. It eroded. He could feel that erosion begin. He checked the watch again. 02:56. 3 minutes since he last decided to wait. The hand on the dial moved like a pendulum measuring doubt. He thought of the train switches again, how the simplest movement, a single turn of the wrist, could redirect thousands of tons of steel. Timing, not strength, determined safety. He had been trusted because he never acted on impulse. Yet this stillness, felt like the very thing that could destroy the order he'd spent his life preserving. He exhaled through clenched teeth, watching the vapor drift upward and vanish. His glove brushed the flashlight's casing. He could almost hear the system breathing through him. The convoys, the trucks, the schedules, all waiting for the smallest correction to return them to motion. Still, procedure held him like a chain. Obedience kept him alive. Instinct kept the system alive. Which one mattered more? Another sound broke the thought. A deep metallic groan, far off, followed by a sharp echo. Tracks tightening. The enemy was repositioning. The ambush wasn't forming. It was ready. Ward's pulse slowed. He no longer saw the decision as choice. The stillness had become the malfunction. He drew the flashlight out, thumb hovering over the frozen switch. It wasn't courage. It wasn't defiance. It was maintenance, a small act to keep the machine from stalling altogether. He clicked the light on, once, twice, then held it steady. In that single act, the system moved again. The forest didn't react. It absorbed the light, cold and indifferent. At 02:57 a.m., Private Elias Ward made the decision. No command, no confirmation, no permission, just silence and a frozen clock. He unscrewed the cap shielding his flashlight, the threads biting against cold metal. Beneath his breath, he counted. 3 short, 1 long, 3 short. Morse from another life. A rhythm once used to reroute trains when signals failed. Back then, it was the language of steel and coordination. Now, it was the language of survival. The beam cut through the snow like a small breath of defiance. It wasn't bright, just a pulse of life in a forest built for death. The light blinked in measured intervals, steady and exact. Below, among the trucks, faint reflections answered. Mirrors and windshields catching fragments of that pulse. Drivers adjusted. Engines shifted from idle to slow crawl. The column began to move, not chaotically, not panicked, but in rhythm, his rhythm. The flow was restored. Ward held his position, hand hovering over the light. He let one final long pulse stretch across the valley. then twisted the casing shut. The glow died instantly, swallowed by blackness. He dropped beneath the roots of a fallen spruce, breath shallow, heartbeat sinking again to silence. Snow pressed over the branches, dampening every sound until even the engines below seemed part of the earth's hum. No gunfire came. No flares split the sky. The enemy had not seen. The valley remained quiet except for the faint grind of tires over snow and the far-off rhythm of tank treads moving west. Somewhere beyond that ridge, armor was repositioning, unaware that its target had shifted course by less than a mile, but just enough to vanish from the line of fire. For a long moment, Ward stayed motionless. His fingers cramped around the flashlight, the metal biting against his palm. He waited for the inevitable, the flare, the shout, the first mortar burst. None arrived. Only wind through branches, whispering across his coat like static. The danger had passed not through combat, but through calibration. Below, the battalion's timing realigned itself. Convoys resumed their schedule. The system healed as if nothing had happened. Ward's signal had lasted fewer than 10 seconds, yet those 10 seconds corrected an entire column's trajectory. By morning, they would report a clean transit. No losses, no contact. No one would note the cause of that survival in any log or after-action report. The act existed only in absence, in the silence that followed. Ward brushed snow from his sleeve and checked his watch. 03 and 04. 7 minutes lost. None remembered. He felt the fatigue of waiting seep into his bones. Not relief, not victory, just the mechanical awareness that a fault had been corrected and motion restored. In war, timing replaced emotion. The system had resumed its rhythm. That was enough. Industrial philosophy once taught that perfect systems required no recognition, only maintenance. Ward understood that now. The front didn't reward precision. It consumed it quietly, folding every act of correction into the broader hum of survival. The trucks would reach their checkpoints. The reports would be stamped. The war would move forward. His light would remain undocumented. By dawn, the forest would show no sign of what had passed. Only the faint imprint of boots, half filled by drifting snow and a small patch of disturbed earth where a man had waited, timed and disobeyed correctly. One flicker, measured and unseen, had rewritten a battalion's fate without a sound. By 04:10 a.m., the forest had gone still again. The convoy moved east, tires crunching through the hardened crust of snow, headlights masked under blackout hoods. Behind them, the valley they had abandoned remained quiet and unseen until the first distant thunder broke the silence. Radio bursts came through at 4:23, fragmented, staticky, half lost in atmospheric interference. Reports from a flank unit. Heavy artillery fire, coordinates half a mile north of their previous position, the 112th's intended route. Ward listened in silence as the voice crackled through. German armor had opened fire on an empty road. Their shells struck frozen timber and powdery snowbanks. The forest erupted briefly in chaos, then collapsed back into stillness. By dawn, Allied scouts confirmed what the radio had warned. The Germans had fired into nothing. The ambush had detonated on absence. Shell craters lined the road like open pits, trees shattered, trunks blackened, ice shattered into shards that glittered under weak light. No bodies, no wrecks, no sign of passage. Just burned snow and the quiet hiss of cooling metal from abandoned gun barrels. The trap had missed not through luck, but through one man's unauthorized light. Ward stood at the edge of that destruction a few hours later. The air smelled of cordite and pine sap. Smoke hung low, coiling through the trees, refusing to rise. His boots sank into ash-gray slush. Snow melted and refrozen into rough glass. He didn't linger. His orders were to rejoin the column, not to reflect. He turned south, retracing the line his men had followed in darkness. When he reached the halted trucks near dawn, the engines were idling in rhythmic harmony. Mechanics adjusted frozen fuel lines. Drivers stamped their feet for warmth. A few looked up as Ward passed. One corporal offered a quiet thanks without context, just the instinctive gratitude of men who sensed they had survived something they weren't aware of. Ward only nodded. His face revealed nothing. He removed the flashlight from his pocket once more, its casing scratched from frost and bark. The bulb had cracked slightly from the cold. The filament inside blackened. A failed tool now, retired after one perfect use. He wiped the residue from its rim, pocketed it again, and fell in behind the final vehicle of the convoy. The line rolled forward slowly, the entire battalion returning to schedule as if the night had been ordinary. The radios cleared up. Orders came through. The system reasserted itself, clean, efficient, unknowing. In the official log, the 112th Infantry's movement was recorded as successful transit without engagement. Nothing more. There was no mention of deviation, no acknowledgement of disobedience, no name attached to the redirection. The numbers remained precise: 0 losses, 0 delays. In the ledger of war, silence was the cleanest entry. The forest behind them continued to smoke for hours. Snow turned gray as the wind pushed ash across the tracks they'd never taken. Somewhere within that haze lay the cratered memory of what could have been, a record erased before it ever existed. Ward never spoke of that night again. Not in debriefings, not in letters. He understood the hierarchy of recognition. Systems received credit, not men. His task had been to maintain flow, and he had done so. No decoration followed, no reprimand either. Just motion restored, machine repaired, line unbroken. Industrial warfare rewarded efficiency, not intuition. A decision that prevented loss was invisible by design. The 112th rolled on toward Bastogne, unaware that their survival had flickered once in the dark, measured in seconds, carried by one man's quiet defiance. In war, what saves the many often leaves no record at all. Would you have dared to alter the system, knowing it would never remember you? By the next evening, the 112th Infantry had reached the forward division post. Trucks lined the frozen lot outside the command tent, their engines idling at low throttle, steam rising in rhythmic bursts. Men moved with the dull precision of fatigue, refueling, reloading, repairing. The machinery of war continued without pause, as if unaware that it had narrowly avoided destruction. Inside the tent, paperwork replaced noise. The after-action report was written in clean typewriter ink. No mention of a flashlight, no record of deviation. The ambush site was described simply: enemy fired on abandoned coordinates, Allied units unscathed. The phrase carried no trace of judgment, no acknowledgement of cause. The official reason for survival was listed as route adjustment due to visibility. It was not wrong, it just wasn't complete. Ward's commanding officer, a man of few words and fewer emotions, read the report twice, then signed it without comment. He knew what had happened. The convoy's change in direction hadn't come from any dispatch. It had come from a single light pattern, unapproved, unauthorized, and precisely timed. Technically, 2 orders had been violated: radio silence and blackout discipline. Both carried punishment. Yet both had saved a battalion. During the debrief, Ward stood quietly near the back of the room. The space smelled of wet wool and diesel. Officers debated causes: German misplacement, fog misreading, faulty reconnaissance. Each theory felt neat, explainable, statistical. Ward didn't correct them. He watched the smoke from a nearby heater coil rise in slow spirals and fade into the canvas roof. The talk of timing errors and map inaccuracies filled the air like static. The system was already writing its own explanation, self-correcting, self-preserving. No one asked for his account. No one mentioned disobedience. The commanding officer's eyes met his once, briefly, during the pause before adjournment. No nod, no expression, just recognition. A silent acknowledgement between men who understood the difference between rule and result. Then, as quickly as it came, the moment passed. The debrief ended with clipped signatures and rustling paper. Outside, the cold bit harder. Ward stepped into the open, the evening wind flattening the tent canvas behind him. The trucks had already begun moving again, their engines synchronized in low unison. He adjusted his scarf, felt the rough metal of his broken flashlight still in his pocket, and started walking toward the signal station. There was no ceremony, no commendation, no reprimand, just another rotation in the larger machine. He resumed his post that night as if nothing had changed. The same frozen wires, the same radio hum, the same slow grind of trucks pulling through snowbound roads, carrying ammunition, fuel, and men toward names that would later become battles. He checked frequencies, logged convoy timings, and kept the rhythm steady. His orders had never mentioned recognition. His duty had never required it. Industrial systems rarely celebrate corrections. They absorb them. The mechanism continued, efficient and unfeeling. Ward was one gear among thousands, small enough to vanish when viewed from distance. Yet within the machinery of war, small gears were often the difference between continuity and collapse. By morning, the incident had already been archived. No faults noted, no heroes named. Ward would remain in service until the war's end, his record unblemished, his act undocumented. The machine had continued, smooth and intact, unaware of the light that had once kept it from tearing itself apart. In the years that followed, the 112th Infantry's survival during the winter push through the Ardennes was explained through maps and probability. Historians trace the event to misread terrain, intercepted German coordinates, and heavy snowfall that disrupted targeting. In archives, the report remained consistent. Enemy fire displaced. Allied column unaffected. Nothing more. The system had already smoothed its own record, turning an instinctive act into statistical fortune. Ward's name appeared only once in the surviving paperwork, misfiled under communication relay. A clerical note, nothing to draw attention. The flashlight, confiscated weeks later for replacement parts, was logged as damaged equipment. The entry carried no weight, no context. Its light had existed for seconds, its consequence for miles. In the larger design of the war, it was invisible. One correction among thousands that kept the vast mechanism of supply and movement intact. Every convoy that reached the front relied not just on orders and schedules, but on the quiet improvisations of men who refused to let stillness define outcome. They were never cited. Their actions were maintenance, not history. The Ardennes campaign would be remembered for its confusion, for the fog that blinded pilots, for radios lost to static, for frozen fuel lines that turned machines into monuments. Amid those failures, Ward's disobedience never registered. Yet within the logic of industrial warfare, his act fit perfectly. Systems do not survive through perfection. They survive through adjustment. His flashlight, standard issue, 6-volt, with its casing stripped bare, became an unrecorded node in the Allied logistics network. A temporary bridge between collapse and continuation. For 10 seconds, it carried the pulse of an entire battalion, redirecting men, fuel, and motion. Then it vanished into silence, replaced by newer equipment, newer men, newer errors corrected in the dark. By the end of the war, Ward returned home with no citation. His personnel file listed no commendation, no disciplinary record, just service completed with reliability. He resumed work on rail lines, inspecting switches, recalibrating signal boxes, and maintaining schedules that most would never think about. His world before and after the war remained the same, defined by rhythm, precision, and systems that function only when invisible. For decades, the story remained buried under the noise of larger victories. The Battle of the Bulge became a chapter of heroism, strategy, and industrial endurance. But somewhere inside that vast machinery of logistics and doctrine lay a forgotten flicker, a rule broken in silence that allowed the system to keep breathing. Every convoy that reached Bastogne, every crate of ammunition that arrived by dawn, carried the unseen echo of that decision, a pulse that began in a frozen valley at 2:57 a.m. It wasn't courage that defined it, nor defiance. It was calibration, the act of restoring movement when the system faltered. Industrial wars are remembered through factories and tonnage, through generals and divisions, but their survival often depends on men like Ward, technicians of instinct, operators of rhythm, who act not to stand apart from the system, but to keep it alive. History forgets their names because the machine they preserve demands silence. The record stays clean, the numbers stay exact, and the light that saved them burns only in memory, never in print. Would you have trusted your instinct enough to rewrite the system for 10 seconds?